Hello and welcome back to ABG Investor Days. My name is Adrian Gilani and I'm an equity research analyst here at ABG. Today we are glad to be joined by the CEO of Hexicon, Marcus Thor, who will give a short presentation about Hexicon, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A after that. But Marcus, I will leave it up to you with your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for having me here. Today I'll be speaking about floating offshore wind. So a segment of offshore wind that is in deep waters. And this is what we do at Hexicon. So my name is Marcus Thor and I'm the CEO. And let's get to it. I will today go through a brief of Hexicon, of what we do and our business model, followed by market developments, so what we see happening around the world of floating wind, that is, a business update from Hexicon, and be finishing up by looking forward. And to start off with, so Hexicon is active in floating offshore wind further off the coast and in deeper waters. And in these areas, we do two things. So we are both a project developer and a technology provider. We have our own patented technology, which is disruptive in the way of having two turbines on the same foundation, and I'll come back to that. That technology is very much driven towards the lowest possible cost of energy and the best chance there is to coexist with other stakeholders out at sea. On the project development side of the business, we focus on the early stages of development to originate new opportunities in new markets and take those through the early development steps where the value enhancement is great. That combined with, on the project development side, bringing in investors and partners fairly early. On the technology side, we're outsourcing a big portion of the specific designs when it comes to projects. That allows us to maintain a asset-light operations. So that keeps our capital intensity low of the operations and enables us to scale the business model into several projects and geographies. So we are currently active with projects across Asia and Europe. We just gotten going in the US, which will be a significant long-term market for floating wind. And we'll be looking to add new markets to that in the near future. We're based here in Stockholm, and we are 25 people, all but 3 located in Stockholm. We've got 2 in the UK and 1 in the US. So I wanted to start off diving straight to what we're heading for. What is our vision and goals? And here, at a timing that is 2025, where we see that floating wind has gone from what it is today, which is test and demo and small-scale project of a handful of turbines only. There are total 18 turbines on floating foundation in full scale around the world, and that can be compared to over 10,000 on the seabed globally. There are, however, enormous amounts of planning ongoing across Asia, Europe, and the US for floating wind projects. So we will, during this decade, see large commercial scales being deployed. So what we see during the mid of this decade is that floating wind has transformed from early stage R&D into an important part of the energy mix. We see ourselves being a leading player within that field, and it's about ensuring that we maintain the early position that we have already created by being a very early mover in this space, maintain that role for Hexicon in the years to come, and that our technology is verified, proving all the benefits that we see and that we have spent years in assessing, that those are verified in full scale, and that our technology is an obvious choice for developers around the world. Specific goals: we want to have projects around the world with ongoing revenue generating operations in both Europe, the US, and Asia. Technology, that the twin wind technology is verified with all benefits proven. And finally, on the financial front, that across Hexicon AB, the group operations that were EBITDA positive. How will we get there until 2025? We'll continue to work with partnerships. So we see ourselves as one success factor is to continue to deepen both existing and new partnerships. And I think that's especially important in the early days of creating a new market. We'll continue to mature, optimize, ultimately scale our technology for it to be used in big volumes, and continue to expand our competence base and organization across the geographies where we are active. So where are we and why are we developing a rather large project portfolio? Well, first of all, I'm extremely pleased where we are today, given, as mentioned, the fact that we are a company of 25 people and have managed to get the project portfolio of a net holding of around 2 gigawatt already. We're doing it for 3 main reasons. One is that revenues from project developments is shorter term than the technology. So this is part of the diversification across different legs of the business model. So we're seeing an ability, and we're already having revenue from the project development side of the business. So that's shorter term revenue potential compared to the technology. Second reason is that, of course, each project is an opportunity to install the technology down the line. But first we have to, in parallel, which we're working hard towards, and I'll come back to that, verify our own technology. We can't expect the technology to be used in greater volumes before it is verified. So to build a pipeline of projects enables an opportunity down the line to use the technology. And lastly, we're on a high growth journey. We are building our brand and position in this global arena. And there's no better way in my head to do that, to build a credible brand and to be associated with the right projects in the right markets with the right partners. So I'll come back to projects, but we have what we define to be projects in both South Korea, Scotland, England, and Sweden currently. So the technology then, which we named TwinWind. And the reason the word twin there is, of course, that there are 2 turbines on this floating foundation. And this is very different from almost all of the competition, where you would see 1 turbine on each floating foundation. Why do we think it's good, and why do we think we can place 2 turbines on the same foundation? Well, the key is that you're able to rotate this platform. So in the triangular shaped steel structure, the front corner that does not hold the turbine on it is where the mooring system is attached from beneath through what's called a turret. And that is basically a big bearing. So this allows the whole unit to rotate with the wind direction. So just like if you were to throw out the anchor from the bow of the boat, that boat would swing with the wind direction. And so will this technology. And that allows and ensures that the 2 turbines do not disturb one another. So they are maintained out of the wake of one another. And that means that we can place them very close to each other. And what that then gives you is a higher, what we call power density. So to squeeze in more turbines, more capacity, more electricity out of any given area. And this is important for 2 reasons. One is that it has some direct cost benefits, reduction of the amount of cable, etc. But it also is a way to add a higher likelihood of avoiding conflicts at sea. And any project development, especially when it comes to large infrastructure, is associated with a lot of needed engagement with various stakeholders. So to make sure that you avoid or minimize the conflict with other stakeholders is key, not only to executing the projects themselves, but for a swift permitting process. So the 2 main design drivers of the technology, one is the obvious cost of energy. But secondly, it's also about offering a truly sustainable technology. And by sustainable, what we mean by that is that coexistent part. So to be able to develop offshore wind in a coexistence with everything else out there, biodiversity, other man-made structures, shipping, military, birds, visual impacts, etc. And I'll come back to, we are working very actively right now towards the first installation of this technology in full scale in Norway, and that's targeting to be installed end of next year, and I'll come back to that project. So brief look around the world of floating wind, I wanted to mention three things. One is for a Swedish company to, of course, mention a lot that has happened very lately in the Swedish context. And that is that the Swedish government came out a few weeks ago with a new offshore wind target through new marine spatial planning to provide an additional 90 terawatt hours a year from offshore wind. And although personally I would have liked to have seen quite a lot more details to this, not the least the timing associated with it, I think it's worthwhile reflecting on that it is the first time we've seen a substantial target for offshore wind in Sweden ever. So it is, a market that is certainly very swiftly going in the right way through the lens of offshore wind. In the US, the Biden administration is working very actively to put through a series of auctions. 7 in total have been decided for, and the last one was closed as late as just a week ago. The New York Bight, which I think gathered over $4 billion in so-called option fees or revenue to the state. And the largest one from RWE, they paid for one concession over $1 billion. So the US, in my opinion, is one of the larger long-term markets where we've just, since February 1st, have our own country manager working to position ourselves in that market. And lastly, I want to mention, sorry, now I got the wrong slide here. Here we are. Also want to mention what happened about a month ago, which was ScotWind. So the Scottish government and authorities have been planning and paving the way for an auction in different sizes across Scottish waters for several years. And those results came out just about a month ago, which is an extraordinary amount of 25 gigawatt of offshore areas in Scottish waters being awarded. And remarkable here is that 15 of those 25 gigawatt was in floating areas, so deep water areas. And not only the number itself, but two additional takeaways is one, that the world's largest offshore wind developer, Ørsted, Danish Ørsted, for the first time has now entered a floating project. And secondly, that the price difference for the option fees that were paid, and these are from developers from all across the globe, I think there were over 70 bids for these various areas. The price difference was around 15% between floating sites and fixed bottom sites. And then you need to keep in mind again what I did mention earlier, that floating turbines, there are only 18 around the world, and there are over 10,000 on the seabed. So the maturity is very different, but the way the industry values floating versus fixed opportunities are not that different. On to a business update of Hexicon. So I just wanted to start with mentioning a few highlights since our IPO. So we listed the company in June last year on First North here in Stockholm. And a few of those highlights is that our flagship project in South Korea that we're undertaking together with Shell have now secured all EGB licenses, which is a power permit in the Korean context, for the complete area with a total output of 1.3 gigawatts. Here in Sweden, we during the summer have created a joint venture called Freja Offshore, where we are together with our 50-50 partner Aktier Offshore Wind, developing multiple sites both on the east and west coast of southern Sweden. In Norway, I demonstrate the project is speeding up towards fabrication start, where we during the period from the IPO have secured the turbine supply, so 2 Vestas turbines that will be used, and have partnered up with global contractor Worley to build the project. We have penetrated and engaged in new markets, including both the US and Italy, where we set up a new joint venture and project ambitions. And lastly, that Cohen's Hexicon, our joint venture with medium-sized company Cohen's in Korea, is outside with the project that we're doing with Shell, is developing new areas. And we have, during this period, secured 4 additional areas, around 400, 450 megawatt each, around the coasts of Korea. And a brief look at the overall project portfolio. So again, our way of working through focusing on origination, bringing it through the early value enhancement steps, then inviting investments and partners fairly early, has allowed us to scale this into a substantial project portfolio. And by certain criteria, site control being a key one, we have a definition difference here between projects and prospects, which is a maturity difference. And on projects, we are working in both South Korea, as mentioned. We're operating there together with Shell and have been there for a few years. Towards a 1.3 gigawatt project, Hexagon's holding in that is 10%, and they were targeting a fabrication start somewhere at the end of 2024. So this is a market that's just pausing for a second on South Korea, and I lived there myself during 2019 to get this project off the ground. That's a country where the government has made some very bold decisions to kick off the floating wind market. So they are actually incentivizing through their green energy certificate system, they're incentivizing projects that are further off the coast and in deeper waters. So they get a premium the further off the coast and the deeper water you are in on the electricity you get paid for. So this is a way of promoting projects further off the coast where there is less conflict with near coastal activities, including the fisheries and the military. And I think that's for a country like Korea, there was no other way than to go to floating wind, and they desperately need it. It's a very small country in relation to the 50 million that live in it. It's a very mountainous country, so doing anything large scale onshore is really not an alternative. And most areas are fairly deep. So it was early on identified as floating wind needs to be a key ingredient of the energy mix. How do we promote early projects to get that industry start rolling in the right direction? In Scotland, our early developments several years ago actually have, during the beginning of last year, was sold to Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, the majority of it. So we've sold 90% of that project, and that's now being redeveloped and re-permitted for a 100 megawatt project under the leadership of Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. I did mention Sweden, so we're in joint ventureship there with Aktier Offshore Wind, developing multiple sites, capacity of at least 3 gigawatts on both the east coast and the west coast. And Sweden is quite interesting, being a fairly unregulated market in the offshore space, but the fundamental need, where I think that the alternatives are very few, looking at the electricity demand in the southern part of the country and how that will increase over time. So the fundamental need that you can sort of satisfy in a timely manner, there are no other good alternatives in my head. So floating wind, not only floating, but offshore wind needs to be an integral part, I think, of the future of the energy mix in Sweden. I'll come back to England in just a second because it's related to technology. And on prospect side, what I want to mention is that Hexicon's sweet spot market are the ones that are not necessarily fully regulated yet. So if you look at the fully regulated auction scheme markets, highest bidder, you pay, hundreds of millions of dollars and more for seabed. Those are not markets where Hexicon lead the developments. The ones that have the prerequisites to become such a regulated market and to really where floating wind is bound to happen, but it hasn't taken off yet, those are the ones that we place our risk money on and our bets on. And this we did very well timed in Korea, and this we're pursuing additional market opportunities in countries such as South Africa, Portugal, Italy, and more, where we think floating wind will inevitably come, but it's not really taken off yet. So as a technology provider, the burden of proof is with us. And our technology roadmap for the twin wind technology is a two-step approach. First, we've got our proof of concept, which is a demonstrator project intended to be started fabricated end of this year, installation end of next year. It will be a single unit with 2 3 megawatt turbines. And here we're working with international global contractor Worley, who will not only take over the engineering ahead of fabrication, but then fabricate the whole project. And they have their own shipyard infrastructure in Norway. Following that, we've got what we named the Twin Hub project in England. And there might be a slight confusion here between all these words using twin, but I'll stick with Norway and England. So in England, we last year acquired a piece of seabed intended for wave power. And this is now being developed for floating wind instead, using our own technology. And these two projects are very different in terms of what they provide to Hexagon, where the demonstrator in Norway is very much a proof of concept. And the project in England, not only in a different environmental perspective with waves and currents and winds, etc., but it's in a different market, it's a larger scale, multiple units, and it's under commercial terms. So we aim to participate there in the UK subsidy support scheme called the Contracts for Difference, which in this allocation round this year is the first time that they've ever had an allocated budget for floating wind. So this is actually open and ongoing now and will close later in this spring. Subject to being successful in that, we aim to commence the construction somewhere mid next year for a start of operation and the year thereafter. And I think fairly well timed now. Just wrapping up a little bit, looking ahead, where is our focus? It's very much on two things, which are the two legs of our business model. The technology with a focus to prepare it for the construction start in Norway, and at the same time to go through a successful bid process for Twin Hub, the stepping stone project, second step in the technology roadmap in England. And on the project side, to continue to mature existing projects in our portfolio and add new such to it. Because I'm absolutely convinced that the rate, the speed of developments in the offshore space, not the least floating, there will be so many new opportunities in new markets over the next few years. And the earlier you can position in selected such, the better. And we'll continue to grow our organization and capacities to grasp as much as we can of that opportunity and that growth of this sector. So with that said, I truly want to thank you all for listening, and we'll now hand over to questions.
Okay, thank you, Marcus, for your interesting presentation. I think we have time for a few questions, so I'll go right ahead. First of all, just talking about sort of the cost per megawatt hour produced for floating offshore wind, how does that compare today against fixed bottom offshore wind and as well as onshore wind, and how do you expect that to change going forward?
Well, I think extremely relevant question, of course. And if we look at floating wind today, it's more expensive than fixed bottom. But then let's remember also that 18 of those has been built to date compared to over 10,000 on fixed bottom, and even more so onshore, of course. Yeah. So what we're seeing now, and together with a lot of industry colleagues, is that we're pushing hard for what we think is very much achievable, which is to push costs down to around 50 euro per megawatt hour towards the end of this decade, so towards late 2020s. Yeah. And this is where it needs to be deployed at scale. And worthwhile mentioning as well that the comparison between floating and fixed, yes, it's relevant, it helps, but in a lot of markets, and the reason for the swiftly developing floating wind and maturing the technology is that a lot of places around the world do not have the luxury of large areas of shallow water where bottom fixed is more competitive. So as soon as you go deeper than somewhere 50, 60 meters, start becoming competitive with floating foundations. And on a global perspective, most waters are deep. Somewhere in deployable waters near coastlines, somewhere 80% of waters around the world are deep.
Okay, so looking at your advantage, being able to sort of install turbines further away from the coast, what's the competitive landscape like there today? Are there any competing technologies, or is your solution sort of a first mover in this space, would you say?
No, there are certainly competitors. Like any good space to be in, there's always competitors. And I would put it this way, I think I've seen at least over 50 different proposals and solutions for floating foundations. So just to be clear, it's the foundation. We don't do anything with the turbines. Yeah. It's the foundation that the turbines sit on. And out of those 50, 4, I would say, are more mature than we are. Not saying better, but they're more mature. Yeah. And the rest are a few in line with our project progress, and the rest behind. So we're certainly one of the early movers. We need to get it installed, which is happening end of next year. And I also think it's extremely important that the very few that have been tested in full scale yet, none of them have been built in series yet and used at commercial scale. And the industry deserves to continue to, be offered alternatives. We need to continue innovation, especially disruptive ones like we're doing. And just mentioning quickly on the competitive landscape and how we view floating wind as well. One reason for going further offshore, and one thing that's benefit for all floating technologies, is that you can be more flexible in where you site these. So you're not constrained by water depth. That means that you can more freely place them in the higher wind locations, not higher wind and being constrained by sea, water depth, which is the case for bottom fixed technologies.
Okay, those are interesting points. I think I have time for one last question until we have, and then we have to wrap up. But we've seen sort of energy prices spike recently, and we've seen the supply of energy, or the shortage of energy supply. Talk a bit about how this affects you directly at Hexicon, and also how this affects sort of the market and the demand for floating offshore wind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we'll see more. if the core reason and the driver for our existence and developing projects have been the transition from fossil generation into renewable generation. I think what's happening right now, which is, I'm not even going to speculate the full effect of it, but I think that what we'll see is that we'll place almost as high as transitioning to renewables, we'll place another criteria and word to it, and that is security of supply. Not being dependent for Russian gas and other imports. So alongside transitioning to renewables, will add security of supply to that prioritized key driver criteria for developing these projects. And that means an added amount of domestic developments. We certainly need to go as fast, or even faster, I would say, to this renewable place. For our, in addition to, of course, it's very much been discussed, and how military perhaps even a more important stakeholder now than ever. So those type of discussions have started to increase. But I think one direct change that we could see is where you locate these projects, where certain markets are more vulnerable, have more dependent on the specific of being Russian gas.
Yeah.
So those, I think, will have a huge demand in the short to medium term going forward.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you again for your presentation and for answering all of my questions. And I'll just leave it up to you if you have any final remarks before we round off.
No, just thank you for listening, everyone. And it's been a pleasure, and I hope to come back soon and speak again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.